brings us on to tonight's presentation then. Pleased to welcome Philip Gibbs from London Fire Brigade, who's going to be presenting about fire safety in hospitals, really be outlining the regulations relating to that and looking at major risks and the management procedures to manage those risks. I think we all know that the potential for high risk in the event of a fire in a hospital is quite large, and I think we've probably all seen the pictures from a few years ago with the Royal Marsden, which, you know, obviously it was a huge issue that made the national news. But there's a whole lot of building stock of various different ages, complex processes, equipment, and obviously people who have lots of mobility issues. So, although tonight I've said, you know, previously, although this is primarily focused on hospitals, hopefully what we'll get from this is, you know, transferable regardless of what business we're in, that, you know, people with mobility problems and some of the problems we face in hospitals, I'm sure, are going to be very transferable to many, many industries. Philip is a team leader for the Westminster West Fire Safety Regulation Team from the London Fire Brigade. It's a team of fire safety inspecting officers who enforce the fire safety regulations and give advice for the Borough of Westminster. Prior to his current position, he was a technical auditor responsible for auditing fire performance of all fire safety inspecting officers. He's previously a fire safety inspection officer in Borough of Camden and the Borough Hospital Liaison Officer. He's got a master's degree in healthcare fire safety management with Loughborough University and is a graduate member and accredited fire safety auditor with the Institute of Fire Engineers. So I'll hand over to Philip, and really, as I always say, if you do have questions, really unless it's majorly pressing, we'll have a Q&A at the end, and we'll have microphones, and if you've got a question, please wait for the microphone so that everybody else can hear. So I'll hand over to Philip.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay at the back and everywhere else? Thank you very much for sparing the time to come and listen to me tonight. I understand I've got 50 minutes, and the general rule is you ask questions at the end, 10 minutes or so. Just got to find my presentation. Oops. Where's the dibber? Oh, there it is. Okay, well, thankfully I don't need to introduce myself. That was an excellent introduction. Thank you for that. Don't need to talk about any of that. I'm going to talk to you today about fire safety in hospitals. It's broken down into 3 areas, and the first 2 areas actually relate to other buildings that you may occupy yourselves or have some involvement in. The first bit is going to be about fire safety regulation, which is the law. Then I'm going to talk about general fire safety issues in hospitals. There are lots and lots of fire safety issues in hospitals, but I'm just going to pick on some that I've come across as a fire safety officer myself, and also some of the areas which we know come up certainly when there are fires in hospitals. And then the third bit is when fire safety fails. There's 2 case studies, and I think I can cover them both, and one of them, interestingly, is the Royal Marsden, actually. Let's begin. I'm going to talk about fire safety regulation now, and this applies to everybody, not just hospitals. And I'm going to start with the law. I have here a copy of the predominant law, the fire safety law in the UK. You don't need to look at this, but the reason I'm showing this is it's not very big. There's not much in it. It's called the Fire Safety Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005, and it came out in 2006 as it happens. And although it doesn't look much, and it doesn't actually give you a lot of direction in here, a lot of it's about when, where necessary, where as adequate, all sorts of terms which don't really determine what you must do, but it's actually a very powerful law. And one of the reasons it's very powerful is it's very good at determining who is responsible for fire safety in England and Wales. And the person that's responsible in England and Wales is called the responsible person. It details and defines who is the responsible person. The responsible person is normally a limited company or employer, and then below that we have the person who may be in control of the premises, and then below that we have the owner. It's hierarchical. So that's the next bit. The thing that I wanted to stress next is, once we've defined who is the responsible person, this law is very good at finding that person if there is a deficiency which could possibly cause a death or a serious injury. And in my experience in the Brigade, I think I've only known this law to fail once in finding somebody, and that was in a fire in Camden a few years ago, and it was in what was thought to be a massage parlour, and it was actually a brothel. And it was in the basement of a building. It wasn't well known it was a massage parlour or a brothel, and I don't think it had been there that long. But 2 people died in a fire in the evening. And the 2 people that died were a client and, we must assume, the prostitute. And they were in a room on their own in this building. Anyway, the basement caught fire, and the end result was these 2 people died. And it was very obvious when, after the fire was put out, that there were serious fire safety deficiencies. And which meant we could use this law to prosecute who was responsible. So my team leader at the time was in charge of the investigation then, and the first thing he did said, yeah, let's go and find the responsible person. And the responsible person is, if it's an employer, they have absolute responsibility. So the first thing we did is say, where's the employer as the responsible person? Well, it was probably a criminal organisation running this massage parlour stroke brothel. So did we have a telephone contact for the mafia? No, we didn't. So that was that one out of the way. Remember, it's hierarchical. You start off with the employer, then you go to the somebody who has management responsibility for those premises. So the next point of call was, well, what about the manager of the massage parlour stroke brothel? Well, the next morning nobody turned up. They'd all got word. So no look there. And the final port of call was the owner. And you can normally find an owner somewhere. Somebody's got deeds on the building. And in fact we did find an owner, but it was a tenuous link. They were in Jersey or somewhere. And we didn't pursue that. So actually 2 people died. Rare case for this law. 2 people died and we didn't prosecute anybody. And nobody was culpable for that. They were culpable, but we never found them. So very strong law. But it can fail occasionally, but very often it will always find the responsible person. Next, I'm going to talk about fire safety audits. And this is the way the London Fire Brigade enforces this law. We have a duty under this law to enforce it. And we carry out fire safety audits, and I dare say some of you have experienced those at some point. Can you put your hands up? Has anybody experienced a fire safety audit from the London Fire Brigade? Yeah, quite a few there. So you probably know the format. Various colleagues of mine throughout the London area regularly visit premises against risk. Normally we do it against risk. We also have a programmed schedule of audits where buildings that we know about we may visit regularly, but again we do it against risk. So for instance, hospitals we will visit more regularly than maybe an office block, and we're looking more and more into addressing risk. We're trying to not go to premises that we know are well run, have good fire safety record and good managers. We really want to address the risk, because the risk is where people die. That's what we're looking for. A fire safety audit is where we would look at things like training methods, maintenance records, the fire safety within the building. You generally have a good look round as well. And in a moment I'll talk about enforcement. That's the, I've jumped a bit here. When we do a fire safety audit, it is a review of the way a responsible person manages their fire safety audit responsibilities. It ought to be pain-free. I'm sure it is for those of you who already experienced one. We don't charge for that, and that's probably reasonable because most of you don't want us to visit. We force ourselves on you because we have a legal duty and a right to enter virtually any building in London we want to at any reasonable time. We have warrant cards, and if anybody obstructs an officer at any time, you're actually breaking the law if you do that. I talked about risk and how we audit premises against risk. This is how we calculate the risk. We have a relative risk level matrix, and you probably can't see very well there, but it's divided in columns, and each column is a type of building. I'll just point at some of them. For instance, we've got offices here, shops. At the end there is hospitals, and you can see the levels of risk here. These are risk scores, and these figures in the boxes are months. So if you've got a higher score with certainly a red in it, that means we'll visit you more often. So after an audit, if we went to a hospital and found it came to a relative risk score of 6.75, then that particular building we would audit every 6 months. And I don't know of any hospitals in London that we would audit every 6 months. That's quite a high risk, and we would expect something to be done about that and the risk to be reduced. But as it goes down in risk against these types of buildings, we get less frequency of auditing, and this red line is set by ourselves. Actually, we can reset that whenever we want according to how we find the risk in London, and below the line is where we sample audits. So A, B's and C's are just a sample pot. So many audits are carried out against those buildings from a random sample, but all the figures in all the numbers are actually months on frequency of audits. Moving on from that, the result of an audit can be one of several things. It can be enforcement. Often, and I would expect most of you have experienced this, it's what we call verbal advice, where there's no real problems with what we've found, and we just give verbal advice on maybe just improving minor things. However, we do have a variety of levels of enforcement, ranging from verbal, as I just mentioned, up to an enforcement notice, which is a letter with some red ink on it, and I would suggest most of you don't want that. And that tells you exactly what you must do to address whatever was wrong when we were there. And above an enforcement notice, we have prosecution and also prohibition. Prohibition is quite an interesting power we have. I have personally only used it twice in the 8 years I was an inspecting officer, and that is where I could turn up to a building to do an audit, and I find that the fire safety deficiencies are so serious that I consider that people could die in that building, and I can actually evict, and this is what I did twice in pubs, evict the people from that building within about 3 hours with a notice. Once the paperwork's written and it's issued, the parts that have been prohibited, and that may be all or parts of the building, have to be vacated whenever that prohibition says so. And I've done that twice, and I've done it above pubs normally, where there's accommodation above pubs for the staff, and it's totally inadequate, and if there's a fire there they would probably die, and those people have been basically homeless within 3 hours. It's not a nice thing to do, but it's a power we do have. That's enforcement, and prosecution as well is perhaps our most serious one, and the ultimate sanction is prison. If somebody can be proven to be culpable in causing somebody's death through fire, you can actually go to jail, and that's happened a few times in London. I'm now going to talk about, that was the legal stuff. I'm now going to talk about fire safety issues in hospitals. And just a bit of a background to begin with, and I'm going to start off with a picture of a Victorian hospital. That still exists. That's one of the buildings at St Pancras Hospital, which I used to audit. Maybe some of you recognise it. In London, in Camden, it's sort of behind King's Cross. There's several of those types of buildings on that site, and it's what would have been a typical Victorian hospital. You can't see it very well there, but it's rectangular with a central stair at one end and stairs either end. And certainly in Victorian times and slightly before, the wards inside that hospital would look something like this. And you may have heard of the term Nightingale Ward, which is named after a famous nurse called Florence Nightingale, who was around during the Crimea, about 1850, 1860. She didn't invent that, but she helped design the concept of it. And it's when the medical profession was really starting to understand about various diseases, how they're spread, what caused them, and they realised that actually looking after people in a pleasant environment with good air circulation, space between the beds, and also these big windows, it was all a good idea, and it did help people recuperate. Just bear that picture in mind, because I'm going to compare it with something else that's coming up shortly. Just have a think there. If there was a fire there, what is there to burn there? There's a few blankets, bit of furniture, the beds are metal. There's not a lot there. Few bodies. But apart from that, you'd probably have difficulty starting a fire there. Now we come to modern day designs. This is University College Hospital on Euston Road. You may recognise it. That's a typical modern design. Big statements, bold statements, lots of glass. The main thing from a fire safety point of view is what's in them and how it's changed over the years. And that, although that is an intensive care unit, that is typically what we might find inside a ward in a hospital. Compare that with what you saw earlier with the Nightingale ward. Big differences there are, first of all, it's not an open ward. We tend to have 4 and 6 bay wards now, or wards made up of bays. But the biggest thing you notice there is what's connected to the patient. There's all sorts of plastics, hydrocarbon materials, which when it burns gives off huge amounts of acrid smoke. There's electronic equipment, there's television sets there, and crucially there's also piped gases coming through the walls there, which can be used to care for the patient, and most of those gases have got oxygen in them. So if you have a problem there and a fire starts, the oxygen will enrich the fire. So we have all the ingredients for a very nice fire there. So it's something to think about fire safety wise. Not only have we changed the processes that we see in hospitals and the amount of fire loading and the risk of a fire starting, we've changed the types of patients we see in them. So medical professions now can treat all sorts of ailments in hospitals, and you probably know this yourself. You actually have to be quite sick to be in a hospital these days. It sounds a strange thing to say, but do you remember the old Carry On film where they used to be in the ward and they'd be chasing around after matron and they maybe just have a ingrown toenail and they're in there for a week? It did used to happen a bit like that, but nowadays you have to be really sick to be in a hospital bed. If you've got ingrown toenails, you'll be in and out of outpatients probably in hours now. So generally people are really sick. They have these sorts of things and processes attached to them, all increases the fire risk, and crucially it affects how we would evacuate them in a fire. Moving on from that, here's another type of patient which is being introduced into hospitals, and it's a growing problem, and that's a bariatric patient. The study of bariatrics is the art and science of medical weight management, and bariatric patients are typically between 20 stone and 60 stone or more. And as I said, it's a growing problem, and that gives all sorts of issues to hospital staff and anybody else involved in moving around. You've probably seen the programme on the television some time ago, the series about moving around people from their homes generally to the hospital. So for somebody like that to be moved to a hospital, you need a specially designed ambulance, and you also need trolleys and all sorts of things to lift them. Well, imagine that transferred into a hospital. You have to move them around the hospital. It's a huge problem for nurses. There was a survey in 2011 where I think it was 46% of the respondents reported an increase in workplace injuries due to looking after people of this size. And back problem is a huge area which certainly your health and safety colleagues, if you're not already involved with it, are trying to manage in hospitals now. If there are any training sessions in hospitals these days to do with fire safety and evacuation, there's generally a health and safety practitioner standing by to advise on how to lift, move, and if it looks like it's getting a bit dangerous, they'll actually stop the exercise. But you can imagine in a real fire how you would move somebody of that size around. And generally there's lots of equipment available, like this special trolley here, beds, lifts as well, but they all cost a lot of money. And of course the NHS hasn't got that sort of money, so you don't find that everywhere. And one other thing to think about is that you may think that person has just arrived at that hospital or in that hospital because of their weight. Well, that may be wrong. They may have a heart problem and they actually need to go into the cardiac wing. And the cardiac wing is on the 10th floor in the corner. Logically, anybody of that weight, you would put them on the ground floor and never move them, but it's impossible. So they have to be moved around the hospital. That produces huge concerns with fire safety and to do with evacuation. Right, I'm just going to mention a few statistics on what are fires in hospitals, what's the issue. This is from a study which came out in 2010, and these figures are from NHS figures between 2005 and 2009 in Wales and England. And there has been, or was then, a 47% reduction in fires in NHS properties. Crucially, and this is a very interesting point, 50% of those fires are in mental health care units. And I know from personal experience, a lot of fires in mental health care units revolve around smoking, and we'll have some evidence of this later. You might think nowadays that smoking is not an issue because you can't smoke in a workplace. It's still a huge problem in healthcare premises and especially hospitals. And the main reason for that is people still smoke outside, and especially in mental health care premises where you may have section people who don't really want to cooperate. They are still given cigarettes and lighting material to smoke in a secure area, and then that means the cigarettes and the lighters become currency, and they don't regularly frisk or search everybody, so they do end up inside and they can easily start fires with them. And we'll have an example of that, one of those later. 33% of fires at that time were in acute trusts, acute hospitals such as UCH. And the most common injury is smoke inhalation. It's actually quite rare for somebody to die in a fire in a hospital. You probably remember it because it was on the news, and you don't very often hear that. It happens very occasionally, but it's actually very rare. Most hospitals are very well run, and the risk is actually quite small. But again, word of caution there, we'll talk about that shortly in a minute. I'm now going to talk about some of the common fire safety deficiencies that we see in hospitals. So when we're out doing our audits, and certainly in my experience, what are the common things that turn up? There are all sorts of things, but these are some of the common things. We have issues with fire prevention. If fire prevention was perfect, then you wouldn't need a fire brigade, you wouldn't need people like me. The idea is to stop the fire starting in the first place. Very difficult to do. The things that certainly crop up in hospital type premises and where we have issues with fire prevention are rubbish collecting in corridors, all sorts of things stored in corridors because they haven't got a lot of space in hospitals, and that's the means of escape. And that leads us on to arson. Believe it or not, arson is quite a common problem in hospitals. In a large hospital like UCH, I would expect an arson incident probably at least once a year somewhere. And the reason for that is that you can walk in any hospital and walk around for quite a long time and get into a lot of places without anybody really noticing you. and especially if you've got a clipboard, but a lot of arsonists, you can't tell they're arsonists, obviously, and they pick on areas which are quiet and where they can set fire to something easily. And normally they're only small fires, they're put out very quickly and spotted it quickly. But it's always the ones that grow that we're more interested in. That's an issue with fire prevention. Another issue is always maintenance. Everybody in any building, this building has to be maintained, and electricity is always a good source of fire. If you're not maintaining something properly, then there's a chance that certainly electrical faults can cause fire. Having said that, anything electrical can cause a fire. Computers can catch fire. It doesn't matter how new or old it is. Some things cannot be serviced, and it's just pot luck. You just have to hope it's been built properly. Well, the first principle of fire safety is try and stop the fire happening. So that's the fire prevention. But after that, you assume that it will happen. Any of you involved in fire safety and looking at fire precautions should be assuming that you're going to have a fire. And then what do you do about it? There's all sorts of things, but the first thing we would expect to do here is to evacuate the premises. Now, you wouldn't actually do that. You would actually walk out calmly. But the way you would evacuate depends on the way the building's designed, the occupants, and also the fire safety policy within that building. And there are various types of evacuation methods. And in this building, we would all leave together, and we call that simultaneous evacuation. So I haven't had a look, but I assume there's probably fire detectors in here. But you would expect, if there's a fire in this building, and it's not in this room, you would expect to hear the alarm sound. And you've already had some instructions about hitting the alarm, so there's definitely an alarm here. So if we all heard the alarm, we would all get up and calmly walk out those exit doors. Easy. However, if you were that person in that ward, hooked up to all those pieces of equipment, and obviously seriously ill, you can't do that. So in a hospital environment, we have to have another way of evacuating, and that we call progressive horizontal evacuation. And this is where, if you were in beds now, or couldn't walk very quickly or very far, we would progressively move you into another fire-safe compartment, ideally next door. So instead of trying to get you all outside, and it may be snowing in there, and that actually may kill you quicker than the fire would, we'd move you internally to somewhere which is safe, behind the firewall, and then hopefully, if the fire is in here, then my colleagues would turn up, put the fire out. If they couldn't do it quick enough, then you would move to the next compartment and so on. And that's called progressive horizontal evacuation. So I'll show you later. That works quite well when you're on the ground floor. It gets more difficult when you're upstairs. So imagine that Victorian building there with stairs at each end. If we horizontally, progressively moved you along and the fire was chasing you, which if it's serious it can, then eventually you're going to come to a set of stairs. And what do you do if you've got somebody wired up like that gentleman was earlier? Huge problem is evacuation. There's ways around it. The ideal is a lift. But not all hospitals have evacuation lifts, because generally you can't use them in those sorts of situations. And certainly one lift wouldn't get you all out in one go. So I haven't got time to talk about that much, but there are huge issues with evacuating people with different mobility issues, and also to carry on the treatment. That's the other thing, because some people will actually die if you don't carry on treating them, even for a few minutes. That's evacuation. The next issue, which is about compartmentation. I just mentioned compartmentation briefly. Compartmentation is where you divide the building up into fire-safe areas, and certainly with progressive horizontal evacuation, you have a safe compartment, normally next door to this one, and you keep on moving them. And the issues we have there are that it's very difficult, certainly once a hospital's built, to maintain those compartments, because they tend to get bashed, And most new buildings, as soon as they've been built, people start altering them. I don't know if you've noticed that, buildings you've been in. Brand new buildings, let's move the so-and-so department somewhere else. Let's knock a wall down. Somebody with a good fire safety knowledge has designed that building with these compartments in it. And then somebody else comes along and says, oh, that's a bit inconvenient, I'll knock it down. They can knock it down and then the compartmentation's gone. Hopefully it doesn't happen quite like that in hospitals, but believe me, it does to a certain extent. So maintaining the compartments is essential. And not just knocking walls down is a problem, but also just making holes in walls. So you can imagine if you wanted to put a satellite dish in here, this is common in blocks of flats by the way, put a satellite dish here, somebody comes along from the satellite dish company, drills a hole through here, puts a wire in, great big hole there, your compartmentation's gone. And that happens a lot in hospitals, not for satellite dishes, but for all sorts of services. You go around any building of any age and you'll see lots of holes in walls. Doesn't matter if it's not a compartment, but you must know whether it is or not and how to maintain it. Here's an example of a compartment on a floor of a hospital. Those red lines are the compartment lines, and they usually give 30 or 60 minutes fire safety resistance from one side to the other. Something you'll notice here, comparing it with the Nightingale ward, is we have a nurses station which would have been at one end of that Nightingale ward. It's now here, and they can't actually see these bays. So these are bays with beds in them where people may be wired up. These are private rooms. You can see it's completely different layout, and it does require more thought in fire safety, but nowadays we have automatic fire detection, which is the biggest thing there that aids the nurse. So if there's a fire there, the detector in that room will activate and the nurse will know about it. But anyway, if there's a fire in here, they would logically move into the next compartment and keep going. But as you can see, eventually you come to a set of stairs, and that's where most hospitals in the past, and still do I would suggest, do have a problem. So what do you do when you get 20 or 30 people, or are very difficult to move to a set of stairs? There's all sorts of ways around it. I can't really go into that at the moment, but we will see some examples of that later. So that's compartmentation. Now I'm going to come to an example of good compartmentation. You may not think that is, and the fire door. You all know a bit about fire doors. It's what we call passive fire safety. When it sits there on its own, it doesn't need anything to activate it. It doesn't need any electricity, but if it's in place and working, it saves people's lives. Yet it is the most misunderstood, misused piece of fire safety equipment ever invented. Again, you've probably had experience of this. Fire doors have the self-closers removed. They have wedges put in them. They are often damaged kit. They are often replaced with a door which isn't a fire safety door. Most of these doors that we're looking at, they will resist fire for at least 30 to 50 minutes. Whenever you see a fire door and it says, keep it shut, please keep it shut. They're so important. This is why. If anybody was in that room when that fire occurred, and this isn't a hospital, this is anywhere, I don't know where it was, but it could be in your home, it could be in the place you work now. If anybody was in that room, they would have died. There's no doubt about it. If you were in that room, you would be dead. However, if you were at the other side of those fire doors, see the difference? Those fire doors would have been closed during the fire. When my colleagues went and put the fire out, they left them open. But you can see the difference. That is the importance of fire doors. When fire doors are closed, the theory there is, if that was a corridor, you could calmly walk past that fire behind those doors and get out. If those doors are open, the smoke would spread the fire quickly through those fire doors to the rest of the building. This is an example of compartmentation, and it's what we call fire stopping. So remember I was saying about putting holes in walls and putting services through. This is a fire that occurred in a hospital, and this is the non-fire side, and I hope you can see it. It's not too clear, but the fire was the other side of this wall. This was a compartment wall, and various services have been added. Again, after the building was built, it's quite an old building, and this is happening continuously in any building, and it hadn't been fire stopped. Fire stopping is where some sort of foam, fire-resistant foam, is put in the gaps around the services, and it reseals the compartment. And that fire was quite a serious fire, but it would have been contained in the room behind it. It was a transformer behind there. But because of the lack of fire stopping, the smoke came out of there and a few other holes. It went through a ground floor corridor. This was a ground floor corridor, and it went up various other floors and actually went outside the building, and patients 10 stories up were watching smoke coming past them in the window, and they evacuated the whole wing. Very serious fire. It always amazes me, I've never been a firefighter, it amazes me how so much smoke can come through such a small hole. Pressure builds up, forces it out, and usually it's the smoke that spreads the fire, because the smoke is hot, and if there's enough of it, it will first of all reduce visibility to nothing, and it will also spread the fire. Incredible stuff, hot smoke. That's compartmentation. That bit was fire stopping. Here's another issue, and this is common to any premises, but it's particularly difficult in hospitals, and this is staff training. I was talking to somebody earlier, I think, about staff training and how they go about it. Hospitals, especially large trusts, can have thousands of staff, 4,000-6,000 staff. Those staff will be made up of lots of different nationalities. They will have different levels of knowledge, and they will have different tasks, different jobs. So some of them will be nurses and be looking after the types of patients we looked at there. But some employers will be in the office. So they all need different types of training. And how do you go about this? Because you have to do it regularly, and certainly the people who work on the wards are the ones that must have the highest level of training, and they need to know how to get all their staff out, all their patients out safely. Again, it's a huge problem. The biggest issue I have when I'm auditing premises is the difference between complying with the law and being competent in fire safety training. I don't know if you have this in your spheres, your expertise. If they comply with the law says that training must be given where necessary as adequate. It doesn't say how much training or what type. So you could decide that maybe your hospital staff, certainly the nursing staff, don't need to use fire extinguishers. You could decide that, because we'll come and put the fire out. Is that good or bad? You have to determine it in your risk assessment. I would generally say you would need to use fire extinguishers. But it's a very difficult thing to do, and really we don't want to know so much how you comply with the law, it's whether the people are competent in doing it. So often I've been to hospital sites and I've asked about fire safety training and I've been told all the right answers, then the first person I ask on the ward about the fire safety training and how they will get patients out, and they go, huh? It's just gone, it's not in there. So they may have been told, they may have been taught, but they're not competent, and it's the competency bit that matters. Basically, with fire safety training, keep it simple. If it's too complicated, it won't work. It shouldn't be anything difficult. It's basically, is there a fire? Yes, I need to know about it. I either try and put it out, or I move people along and make sure they're safe. But it's a complicated issue in the hospitals. I'm going to give you some examples in a minute of what happens when things go wrong. But first of all, I'm just going to say what should happen generally when a fire starts. And this isn't just hospitals, it's any building. The first thing you want to know, which is, as I said a minute ago, is a warning. So if a fire starts anywhere that's not in this room, because we'd see a fire here, in the building, we want to know quickly, and that is an automatic fire detection system. And in most hospitals now, they have the most sophisticated and best automatic fire detection you can buy these days, with a coverage of virtually everywhere. So I have detectors everywhere, even in toilets. You won't generally see that in a building like this. So generally, the warning in a hospital building is good. You would expect to be warned pretty quickly. The issues can arise on what you do next. So you've got the warning, and there are a lot of false alarms in hospitals, which is another issue. So you'll keep hearing the alarm going off, and you'll think it's a false alarm. What do I do? But anyway, what I said earlier still stands. Fire starts, I need to know about it. Then ideally it's contained. If it's in another room from here, it's contained, we should get out. If it's in our room, we've got to move away from it. Evacuation, mentioned that, you'd want to evacuate. And finally, you'd really want to extinguish it. Maybe you could do it locally if it's a small fire, but otherwise you wait for my colleagues to turn up, and by then hopefully you're all safe. However, what happens when these things don't all happen as they should? I'm now going to talk about two examples briefly on what happens when fire safety goes wrong. Chase Farm was a building on a hospital site, and it was a mental health care facility, and the fire resulted in 20 pumps attendance. A pump is a fire engine, in 2008. And by the way, the two fires I'm going to talk about, just briefly, are all mentioned in a document which you can get off the internet, looks something like this, and it's called The Review of 5 London Hospital Fires and Their Management. Very unusual this. During 2008 and 2009, there were 5 fires in London, very serious hospital fires. Some of you may remember some of them, certainly you'll remember Royal Marsden in a moment. And it was just coincidence that we had 5 within 2 years. And it woke a lot of hospital managers up, because prior to this, it was always assumed, because of our theory of progressive horizontal evacuation, that you never actually need to evacuate a whole hospital or building. You would just keep moving, and we couldn't put the fire out, no problem. But we had some serious fires which involved complete evacuation. This was one of them. There's 20 pumps, which is a lot of fire engines, plus you get all sorts of other vehicles turn up, and it resulted in full evacuation. And I'm just going to describe the building. Part of it was destroyed, but the whole building was actually pulled down. Not a very good picture, this. This came off the internet, and it's not a very good picture because you can't get them now because the building doesn't exist anymore. But this was built only 5 years previously. It was only about 5 years old, to modern building standards. And this is the unit, and it's offices and utility areas here. And there were 4 wards at the back here, divided into 2 upstairs on the first floor and 2 downstairs on the ground floor. And the ground floor was gentlemen, and the upper floor was ladies. And I don't know if I mentioned, it's a mental health care facility. So these people were securing here. They couldn't get out. There's actually a big fence all the way around it. I don't know if you can see it. Specially designed for them, only 5 years old. And when they were designing this, don't know if you can see it very well, just here on top of this ground floor roof, they were going to build a garden so that the people on the first floor could go out and use this garden area. And while they were building the building, they decided that wasn't a good idea. It wasn't very secure, and people could fall off it, all sorts of things. So then, afterwards, after the design was made, and while they were building it, they decided to link a staircase from the ground floor, which you can see there, that's the staircase there. They linked a staircase from the garden area outside up to the first floor, and this is a staircase. But it was an afterthought. It was made of wood, and crucially connected to the eaves of the top of the building. And I shouldn't joke, but this chap could actually be saying, do you realise if you set fire to that, that's what will happen? And that's what did happen. And it turned out to be a very severe fire, destroyed all that back end of the building, and that was what was left of the staircase after the fire. And my fire investigation colleagues attended this fire, and it's often very difficult to determine the cause of fire when virtually everything's burnt. But the theory was that somebody with matches had set fire to the staircase, and it's not easy to set fire to a wooden stair just with a match. You'd have to put something else there, like some paper, and stoke it up and leave it for a little while, and they determined that that's what happened. So that building was burnt down by an external fire source going into the roof space and then going along the roof because the compartmentation wasn't designed very well, and then it went down as well. And the end result was that's the aftermath of the fire where the stair was. The crucial bit here is it destroyed basically the back end of the building, and this is a great example of good compartmentation. This here is a concrete wall going down and separating the front from the rear of the building, and you can see the fire stopped there. Our crews put the fire out, but they didn't stop it spreading. What stopped it spreading to the rest of the building was that compartmentation. So that emphasised my point about fire doors. Although that was concrete, that could be just as well done with fire doors, although not with a fire of that intensity, I have to say. So it was a very serious fire. Thankfully nobody died, everybody was evacuated, but it just shows what can happen with a fire from outside, and that was basically not managing the use of matches. The occupants were allowed to smoke and they were supervised, but not enough. Still a problem in healthcare premises, matches and smoking. Right, next one, I've got 5 minutes left for the Royal Marsden. This was another one of these 5 fires, and it's probably one of the ones you remember the most. This ended up with a 25 fire engine attendant, so it got more fire engines than the previous one. 2008, I think it was just a few months before this one, the other one. And it, again, as the Chase Farm fire, this ended up with a full evacuation of the building. And prior to that, we always used to say, you don't evacuate a hospital, you just calmly move them along. We come and put the fire out, you don't need to evacuate. However, this is what happened. These are the pictures you probably remember. I'll describe it to you best as I can in a second. But a crucial thing here, Royal Marsden is a world-renowned cancer research and treatment centre. And you don't want to do that with somebody who's got cancer. Thankfully, nobody died as a direct result of the fire, but we don't actually know whether anybody died subsequently because of the trauma that would have caused. And there are all sorts of other pictures with patients being moved outside. This was in January. And again, they're out, but they then moved them generally to, I think it was a church nearby. They didn't really have a lot of robust arrangements for what to do with these people after a fire to continue the care, and that's the crucial thing. Big problem there was drugs. So this person would take so many drugs in a day, and those drugs in a building that's on fire, and now you're going to move them, and they need those drugs. Who knows what drugs they've got? Where are the records? Huge issues. They sort of managed, but we don't actually know what the results on the patients were following this fire. But nobody got hurt in it. There's something like 70 or 80 people evacuated and 200 staff. Thankfully, it happened just after Christmas, and it wasn't fully populated. As a lot of people think this would have been a lot more serious if it had been later on in the year. Anyway, that's the extent of the fire. It actually, the damage wasn't as bad as it looked. It was mainly the top floor, and that was like a service floor. In the top floor, there were fridges and various other things. The crucial thing here for me and my interest was that these fridges contained samples of tumour samples, blood samples, thousands of them. And they'd only recently moved these tissue samples from the basement up to the top floor because of an incident in the US where a basement had been flooded. So they moved this up because they were worried about flooding, They put it in the top floor, and a lot of it was destroyed in the fire, lots of records. So although nobody got hurt in that fire, another thing always to think about is the results of fire. It's not just the cost, it's the things you lose. So again, what's the effect of losing all those tissue samples and that research for future cancer patients, and probably some of those in the hospital at the time? We don't know, but it's very bad. It's got a few more minutes. I'm going to try and describe how this fire started, or how we think it started, because again, it was all a bit of a guess. You can probably see this tower here. This is a fairly modern building. I think it was built in 1991, and they were building at the time an extension here. This was a couple of floors down below, and they needed to attach services from this building up to the top floor of this one, and they built this tower here just to enclose these services. That's all that was in it, is just pipes. And it's thought that building work carrying on there through welding possibly set light to some insulation material around these pipes, which went up inside this tower and then went into the roof space, a bit like the other one, set fire to everything that was in the roof space, and then it got so hot it came down. And it also put smoke into the building next door, which is another wing. And the crucial thing with this is there were operations going on. There were people in intensive care, and there were people being operated on. There was somebody on an operating table that was lying there open. And I don't think that's ever happened before in the UK, where a surgeon has had to be told to stop. I heard, I don't know if this is true, but I heard that surgeons, they concentrate so much when they're doing this, that the surgeon was told, we have to go, there's smoke coming in, smoke will be in this room shortly in the operating theatre. And somebody, one of the nursing staff, had to put their hand in front of the surgeon to say, you must stop, you must close this person up. And they did it successfully, and again, we don't know of anybody who had long-term effects from that, but being closed up in an operation because of the fire, you've got to get out. So it's very serious. Again, prior to that, they didn't really have a plan to evacuate everybody from that premises in one go. Now they should, well, they do have now. They've come a long way since then. We've worked with them a lot, and it's a fine hospital, and it's really looked after well now. That's the tower afterwards, and that's where we think the fire started below. Can't guarantee that. But again, that's similar to the other fire in Chase Farm, isn't it? We think it may have started, or certainly spread outside and gone into a roof space. Do any of you ever think that can happen in the premises that you manage? It certainly woke me up when I do audits, because it's not very often you look outside for fire risks. It's all confined to inside. Anyway, that is 50 minutes by my clock. Conclusion is, despite what I've said, hospitals are generally safe. There are lots of fires in hospitals, actually small ones, but they are normally small, and very rarely do they grow to these sorts of proportions. Very rare. Generally very safe. Don't worry about it if you have to go in hospital soon. I hope I won't frighten you. If you need to talk to me, there's my details. Thank you very much.